CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The death of Chad's former President Idriss Deby on the 19th of April has alarmed many foreign and national security policymakers. Chad's central location in Africa, bordering Libya, Niger, Nigeria, and Sudan, places it in a unique position to buffer security threats from several directions. Over the course of Deby's 3 decades in power, Chad had built a reputation for possessing the most powerful military in the G5 Sahel region, an alliance also comprised of Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger that was created to tackle armed groups operating in the region. The vacuum left by Deby's death has many wondering how this will affect the peace and security of Central Africa and the broader Sahel region. This week on the program, we look at the role Chad has played in the war against terror and ask what implications President Deby's death may have on the security and stability of the region. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Although Chad remains one of Africa's poorest countries, it has been seen as a military linchpin in the fight against armed groups in the region. Well, earlier this year, it committed 1,200 troops to the epicenter of the violence, the border zone between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Before we begin our discussion, let's take a brief look at some places Chad has contributed troops to in the last few years in order to help contain the conflicts.
Armed conflicts, drastic climate change, and displacements of people have been the reality for many in Africa's Sahel region for years. The uprising in Libya in 2011 and subsequent violence by militia groups in 2012 in northern Mali led to the displacement of over 300,000 people. The conflict then spread over into neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger. In 2013, Chad deployed 2,000 soldiers to Mali to help defeat the terrorist groups. In 2015, as a response to increased attacks by the Boko Haram terrorist group in Nigeria, Chadian troops moved into the country to join the battle against them. The forces used airstrikes, armored vehicles, and infantry divisions to force the militants back from the borders of neighboring Cameroon and Niger. The insurgency had at that time caused the displacement of over 1 million people, and to date, the terrorists are estimated to have killed over 30,000 people. These conflicts are still ongoing, with Chad playing a central role in the region, both in terms of military support and also in deploying troops as part of UN peacekeeping missions. It is the largest troop contributor to the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali, known as MINUSMA, with more than 1,400 soldiers currently deployed as part of the mission. Sadly, the cost to Chadian life during these missions has been high. One single attack by Boko Haram in Boma, northwestern Nigeria in March 2020 killed 92 Chadian soldiers. Most recently, Chadian troops have been fighting the FACT rebels, a group of Chadian rebels based in Libya who were responsible for the death of President Deby in April.
Well, joining me now to unpack Chad's crises and security in the Sahel, Dr. Kabir Adamu. He's a security risk management and intelligence specialist in the Sahel region. He's joining us from Lagos. Professor Joaf Toka, lecturer at the American Graduate School in Paris, and Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House, joining us from London. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us on the program. I'll start off with you, Dr. Adamu, because the latest developments in Chad have a massive significance, particularly for Nigeria. First, let's get a look at where Chad stands in the issue of security in the West African region. What is Chad's strategic significance that has enabled it to play such a major role when it comes to regional security in West and Central Africa?
Thank you, Beatrice. Chad has First off, because of its location, straddled between West, Central, and to an extent East Africa, plays a strategic role, especially with recent developments following the dislodgement of terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria, and the general consensus that these groups have found a new haven in the Sahel region. So over the last few years, with late President Idriss Deby as the president of Chad, he has played a strategic role in terms of containing the activities of these groups that have found haven. Chad is straddled, like I said, to the south, the Lake Chad Basin, where you have an ongoing insurgency involving both the Islamic State in West Africa province and the Nigerian-based group, the Jamaat al-Ahlissin al-Dawati wal-Jihad. And then on the other hand, in the tri-border, Mali, Libya, and Niger, you've got several other groups that have been active in that region. So more or less, Chad under Idriss Deby has played that stabilization role where it to an extent has attempted to contain the activities of these groups from overwhelming the region, as it were.
So if you look at it though, Dr. Adamu, what is it that has pushed Chad to play that significant role, because it is straddled by all these countries and has spillovers from insurgents? What is at what point, or what is it that pushed Chad into that role?
First off, it's strategic geographical position. Then you can also point at what has been described as the diplomatic savvy of late President Deby, where he was able to maintain very excellent bilateral relationships with countries within the sub-region, as well as the international partners. And so it's not, for any reason but that diplomatic savvy that France situated the headquarters of Operation Barkhane in Chad. To an extent, even the US has a very good strategic relationship with Chad under President Idriss Deby. The siting of the headquarters of the multinational joint task force in N'Djamena, Chad, and several other bilateral as well as multilateral diplomatic successes that have been achieved by President Idriss Deby, some of the reasons for this rule by Chad.
Well, one of the countries that is watching the issues that are developing in Chad must be France, because Professor Atoka, France has been very involved in the issues in Chad. What are the French interests? What does France see, apart from the, the colonial heritage with Chad? What does France see as some of its benefits from its military obligations in Chad?
I would say that the answer is somehow paradoxical, because France does not have direct interest in Chad per Chad in terms, for example, of natural resources, which may be the case with other African countries or any other affinities. The fact that France is so deeply involved in Chad is related to the fact that Chad had a relative stability for a very long period of time. That Chad has military forces which were made available to cooperate with the French and other Westerns in conflicts which were not necessarily happening on Chad soil, but rather in the Mali, in Sudan, in Libya, and elsewhere. So it was an indirect benefit, if you wish, which had been installed over decades, in spite of the fact that indeed the French did not reshuffle their policy towards Chad per se.
Right. Paul, I want to hear your thoughts on this, because the sudden death of President Deby has caused serious implications and concerns in the West African region, particularly when it comes to that war against insurgency. Now, how is this likely, though, to impact the security in the Lake Chad Basin and the wider Sahel region?
Well, I think that's the question that at the moment is so difficult to ask, because Chad's role has been so bound up with the personality of Deby. Let's not forget, he came to power 3 decades ago through essentially a rebellion. He built his power, although there were eventually set up some democratic sort of appearances, if you like, some constitutional frameworks that look democratic. He basically built his power on a regime of military force and bargaining with key clans and factions within the very complex social and community background that he had come from in Eastern Chad. And always the army, the military machine, was at the heart of his domestic power structure, as well as his international policy. And so he was able to, his calling card, if you like, was to say, Chad is a big military power and it can be useful in the service of regional stability in the Sahel and as an ally for France in trying to sustain that stability or tackle militant groups. But he could only do it because of his personal profile and prestige and his sort of determination, totally undemocratic, his determination to use force and be a strong authoritarian leader. But we don't know if the new Chad that emerges, depending on how the political bargaining evolves in N'Djamena over the coming months, will have the capacity to sustain that kind of system. And it may well be that Chad turns a bit more towards its internal politics over the months ahead. So we just don't know how much that willingness will be sustained to be a sort of expeditionary military power that Deby was prepared to be.
Right, let me put that to Dr. Adamo because he's watching this from Nigeria, which has been heavily involved as well in the security issues in the West African region. If Chad's security concerns were very much bound by the late President Idriss Deby, then do you think Chad still has the capability to continue with its many security commitments in the region?
So just like the previous speaker mentioned, a lot would depend on how the new government, the junta, is able to respond to some of the internal challenges within the country, how well it's able to establish its presence within the transition period and manage the several consequences of what effectively was a coup d'etat. And how the various stakeholders in the country take that on board. Already we've seen the protest, we've seen how the junta has responded to the protest.
Right.
We've also seen an attempt by them to involve Niger to arrest the FACT leaders. And so it's very obvious that a lot of things would play out in the coming days, and that would now determine what level of regional involvement the Chad as a country would be prepared to take. Now, for Nigeria, already we've heard from the Minister of Defense issuing a statement saying clearly that Nigeria is concerned that another corridor of vulnerability, as it were, would be opened in the Nigerian-Chadian border, and has indicated already that he's deploying additional troops to that border to prevent what could be an influx of both fighters and weapons into the country from that border. So it appears that from a regional perspective, this is what Nigeria and the other countries within the region are pursuing. We've seen statements from Burkina Faso, from Guinea, and to an extent too from Libya, indicating that there are concerns regarding what the outcome of the local development in Chad would have on the region as a whole.
Right. Professor Tokar, of course, at this point, many people will be wondering about the political factors, both domestic and external, that will be shaping Chad's near-term future. What do you think, from a French perspective, though, what do you think will be shaping Chad's future?
I would say that first on the list would be elements of stability, traditional ones, and perhaps more particular one attached to Chad history and political and ethnic structure. This is indeed what the main concern of the French and other Europeans and the Americans to that extent had already expressed since the sudden disappearance, death of President Deby, father. This is also, in a way, at the basis of what seems to be the French, European new approach to the new situation in Chad, namely trying to advocate dialogue within the different ethnic groups, opposition groups, rebel groups, political parties, civil society protagonists, in the hope that these may get together into some kind of dialogue, which was not extremely active, to say it in a very moderate way, during Deby's father, I mean, the late president. So the hope is that if the elements within the Chadian political structure could talk to each other, try to reach or at least define common objectives and do something about it, that would bring about stability. And on that level of stability depends all the rest, including the efficiency of the military machine and the international contact of Chad locally, regionally, and internationally.
All right, gentlemen, we'll take a short break now. A very interesting discussion indeed on Chad's future. And when we come back, we'll look at how the fight against terror in the Sahel may be strengthened. To stay with us. Well, welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me, Dr. Kabir Adamu, Professor Joaf Toka, and Paul Melly. Before the break, we looked at the role Chad has played in the fight against terror in the Sahel region. Let's now look at how the vacuum created by President Deby's death can be filled. Dr. Adamu, let's look at it from a security perspective here, because since 2012, Western countries have, focused on resolving the security crisis in the Sahel region. Is there a clear-cut plan on how these challenges are being dealt with?
So unfortunately, no, in the sense that what we have seen is a focus more on the kinetic approach. So we've seen the establishment of the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad region, and then the G5 in Mali, involving more or less the same countries. However, in terms of the root causes of terrorism, which, I mean, essentially we can play around it, it's all about governance or the lack of it. We haven't seen enough effort in that regard. And to that extent, for a lot of observers, this development in Chad would likely have two ramifications. On the one hand, the tacit sort of approval of a coup d'etat by Western countries that are at the front line of their advocation of democracy, and then of course even by local players, including big regional powers like Nigeria and the East and Central African blocs. Then on the other hand, how will the successes, quote unquote, that has been achieved by fact, if indeed they're the ones that shot and killed President Idriss Deby, whatever the true situation was, their advancement led to his death. And so what ripple effect would that have on other rebel groups and non-state actors within the region? So a lot of this, unfortunately, would also feed into the absence of a clear cut policy or plan to address the root causes of, as it were, terrorism. Now, part of the reasons why we've seen a proliferation of rebel groups, as it were, in Chad and other countries in the Sahel is the absence of a democratic tradition that would allow political inclusion. So the fact that a coup d'etat has been tacitly endorsed really would mean, unfortunately, that even this advancement in terms of the embracing democracy in the region has been set back to a larger extent, unfortunately.
Professor Toka, your thoughts though, because as you mentioned earlier, France has, quite a number of troops, actually about 6,000 troops stationed in the Sahel region, and some of them in N'Djamena, in Chad, though. And there are various ways that the various factors have tried to deal with the Sahel situation. The military option of France and the non-militaristic approach of dialogue and solving the other socio-economic and political situations, which one is bearing fruit?
The problem to some extent with French and, if you wish, Western overall policies, including military policies in the Sahel, for a long time, for almost a decade, perhaps more, if you look at it even on a wider scale. There is no coherent defense policy of France. There are defense priorities, and there are urgent situations. The French are mobilizing themselves, and to some extent their partners in Europe and America to some extent, when particular dangerous situations show up, pump in. There is no alternative French doctrine what to do in order to bring about more stability to the Sahel, apart from doing what they have been doing traditionally for such a long time as the ex-colonial power and elsewhere, namely calling upon more democracy, more dialogue within regimes in Western Africa. And when things get very bad, which was the case in Mali, and by the way was the French fear a few days ago after those mysterious days, when the news about the death on the battlefield of President Deby reached Europe. That was a French concern, a serious concern for a few days until they got the necessary intelligence report, which apparently calmed their doubt. So that's not the danger right now, but may become one, because the situation in Libya is also extremely unstable under different characteristics, and it may show up once again and present dangers regarding both the overall fight against terrorism in Western Africa and the future stability of the new Chad and political.
Paul Melly, I mean, we've been watching the Sahel evolve since 2012, going on to 10 years now. Your take on exactly what is exacerbating the situation? What is it that, what is the biggest challenge to solving that crisis in the Sahel region? And what kind of approach should be taken now to deal with the challenges in the Sahel?
Well, I think we have to remember that even before the violent crisis, this was already one of the most fragile regions of the planet in development terms. These are the countries along the southern fringe of the Sahara. It doesn't rain much. Drought is a big risk. These countries are among the very poorest in the world. There's quite rapid population growth, so that's putting a big stress on resources of land and water and grazing. So you have those big development challenges already. And then there were political fragilities, for example, difficulty in finding in Mali some sort of accommodation with the Tuareg populations in the north that would satisfy their wishes for more autonomy or control locally, but still reconcile with the Malian state. And there are other political problems in other countries as well. And then the militancy problem, this upsurge both in jihadist violence, but
right.
Then that has also played into community tensions. So it's a hugely complex situation. And I think February's summit of the G5 Sahel countries in N'Djamena was interesting. The summit actually hosted by President Deby, the last big international meeting he hosted, which basically agreed to improve both development, but also governance, local administration, and get local services back into these communities. Because when you have alienated communities where there are very few economic options and people are very poor,
right,
that creates a situation where militancy can flare up. So if you don't have security, you can't deliver development and basic services, but they all have to complement each other.
All right. A final comment from all of you. And Paul, let me get your thoughts here at the moment on what you think the roadmap for the Sahel should look like. And do you think there is likely to be a realignment in the region's security matrix, as Chad concentrates on its political situation at home?
I don't think there's likely to be a big realignment. I think the other partners in the security network, which of course is not just France, and not just the Sahelian countries themselves, but also includes the UN, of course, in Mali, and now Takuba, which is a European special forces operation. So you've got quite a lot of countries involved. I think they probably will try to adjust a bit to allow for the possibility that Chad will reduce its military commitment over time. But in terms of the coordination of those issues, the development factors and so on that I was talking about, I think probably the N'Djamena summit agenda that was worked out and new coalition of the Sahel, which is headquarters in Brussels and which is trying to better coordinate efforts across all these fronts, I think those will move forward. I don't think we're going to see a drastic sudden shift in strategy. People know what has to be done. It's just that it's very difficult to actually implement it.
Dr. Adamu, your thoughts? Do you think there's going to be a drastic change of strategy when it comes to Chad and the wider Sahel region?
I mean, already discussions are being held, like we saw at the G5 summit. We know that France, too, at the bilateral level between it and countries like Mali, following the developments there, and with other countries in the region. There are several templates that are out there. So I think it would come as a matter of necessity that issues around inclusion, which my other co-discussants have mentioned, equity, diversity, development issues, security governance issues would definitely have to be addressed. And one of the, I would say, key perspectives that are out there, that this should be homegrown. It should not be, as it were, engineered or moved by foreign partners, irrespective of whether they are former colonial masters or not. The youth bulge in the Sahel and in most of these countries are a tool that, if they are not harnessed, unfortunately would be recruited and be used by the non-state actors, including the terrorist groups that are operating in the Sahel.
Professor Toka, you have the final word.
Well, I'm afraid the final word might not be very optimistic. No, I do not see alignment in a meaningful way. I do not see very good chances for internal stability in Chad in the months and years to come. But even if this is achieved or relatively achieved, I'm afraid that there would be some spillover from Chad through Chad borders into other countries. Now, let it be Libya, in which the situation is extremely shaky anyway, let it be to the west, let it be of Chad. So we can see less stability of Chad being exported elsewhere in the region, which would not make things easier, neither when it comes to fighting terrorist groups, nor for the well-being of the nations of the region.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. A very interesting discussion indeed on the future of the Sahel region. But that's all we have time for this week on the program. But thank you to my guests for your insights. Dr. Kabir Adamu, Security Risk Management and Intelligence Specialist in the Sahel region, joining us from Lagos. Professor Joaf Toka, lecturer at the American Graduate School in Paris, joining us from Paris, and Paul Nelly, Consulting Fellow Africa Program at Chatham House, joining us from London. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist and keep the conversation going, and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, stay safe and goodbye.